everyone. Thank you for clicking on this link. Unfortunately, weather prevented us from presenting this as a live virtual presentation, but we thought the information was important that we still want to record it and make it available for viewing. So my name is Ashley Kunkel. I am the library director of Milton Public Library.
My name is Jamie Anderson, and I'm the assistant director and children's librarian here at the Milton Public Library.
And I'm Keaton Kloss, and I'm the executive director at the Milton House Museum here in Milton.
Yeah, so we are going to do a presentation on Celebrate Creative Black Expression for Black History Month. We wanted to kind of talk about, I believe Keaton's talking about music and kind of past and present. And then we'll talk about books and illustrators, of course, with the library perspective of some Black illustrators and how more diverse books are becoming more available. All right, so
Let's do it.
Okay, I'm up. All right. Well, thank you guys for including me in this. I'm very excited to do this presentation. So kind of like Ashley said, I am going to talk mostly, as I was doing my research, I just kind of was drawn to music. And so I'm going to talk mostly about that, but just giving a little bit of background on where influences for storytelling and music have come from in the Black community, kind of relating back to slavery, since that's a focus of the museum that I work at. So I'm gonna remember to try and move my slides. Okay, just gotta have patience. So roots of creative Black expression, from music to storytelling, the roots of creative Black expression are deep. During the colonial and antebellum periods, enslaved Blacks pursued the right to express themselves using education, the arts, and craftsmanship against pragmatic, customary, and legal restrictions. So you see the most African influence in the early colonial period, because that's when the majority of people were being brought from Africa on the Middle Passage to the United States. And so they were trying to retain that heritage as much as they could. They manufactured drums, banjos, and rattles out of gourds similar to those found in Africa. Enslaved women in South Carolina made baskets using an African coiling method, and in Georgia, they plaited rugs and mats with African patterns. Skilled male slaves brought artistic vision to their crafts as well. So wrought iron gates and grills, for example, provided common forms in which metal workers would display unique aesthetics and sophisticated skill. So before I jump into the music, I just want to show a very brief example. There we go. These are some plantations that are antebellum homes down south that I've actually visited fairly recently. So if you start at the picture with the wrought iron and then kind of go clockwise, that's how I'm going to talk about the pictures. But they're examples of what enslaved labor were doing for their enslavers, far outside just being in the cotton field or working in the house. They were very skilled laborers who were being used to make their enslavers lives better and more beautiful. So the first one is a wrought iron balcony of Belmont Mansion, which is the largest antebellum mansion in Tennessee. The bricks for the iconic octagonal house Longwood is in Natchez, Mississippi, and all of those bricks were made on site by enslaved men during the home's construction in the late 1850s. The next picture, it's kind of hard to see, but way towards the back, it looks like there's some netting that's over a crib that's actually very beautiful, and that was crafted by enslaved laborers at Omu House, which is also in Louisiana. But that crib was then used for the white children to sleep in. So an example of something that was beautiful and was used by the whites, even though it was made by their enslaved people. And then at the bottom, there's a quilt on the bed, and that's at Travelers Rest, which is also in Nashville. That's the home of one of the co-founders of the city of Memphis. And he was a slaveholder, and that was made by one of his enslaved women who they actually believe did almost all of the sewing for the plantation. So clothes, bedding, all of that. She was making that. So those are examples of ways that Blacks were able to develop skills, and you can see how skilled they were. But they were also being, they weren't able to do that for their own benefit. It was always for the benefit of whites. So the contributions of Blacks, the architectural, cultural, and artistic fabric of American society, especially in the southern states, is often greatly overlooked. And that's why presentations like this are important. Many enslaved people were skilled artisans whose work can still be seen throughout the country today. So I just wanted to touch on that just a little bit, because we do a whole presentation on that, but we'll kind of move into more of the musical side of things. So power of music, roots and purpose are kind of the two things I'm going to focus on. According to Smithsonian, music was a solace, a community builder, and a voice for hope during enslavement and afterward in the days of Reconstruction and then Jim Crow. So enslaved people were being brought from Africa, and I think we sometimes forget that Africa is a continent, not many different countries. And people that were being brought from Africa were coming from many different places, many different tribes, so they couldn't necessarily speak the same language. They didn't know each other. And to some extent, enslavers used this to the advantage. They would make sure and mix people up so that people coming from one tribe were not together. And that was trying to stop their communication because that made them weaker. So that was something that they were doing. But music was a way that people could still continue to communicate. They were able to look for kin, countrymen, and women through song. According to a white shipmate who made 4 voyages to Africa between 1760 and 1770, they frequently sing, the men and women answering another, but what is the subject of their songs, I cannot say. So music was a way for enslaved people to express their feelings, whether it was sorrow, joy, inspiration, or hope, and songs were passed down from generation to generation throughout slavery. These songs were influenced by African and religious traditions and would later form the basis for what is known as Negro spirituals, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a little bit later. But I just want to share a short clip from the movie 12 Years a Slave, showing the simple vocalization with no instrument or music of how short, repetitive songs like Roll, Jordan, Roll became a communal exercise of faith and hope. Easily one of the most recognizable spirituals. You may recognize it when they start singing it in the movie. It was written by a Methodist preacher back in the 1700s. It was the very first song recorded in the 1864 book, Slave Songs of the United States. So the life of an enslaved person was greatly restricted, with sometimes absolutely no autonomy given to the individual. Restrictions on reading and writing were heavily enforced in an effort to restrict the communication between enslaved communities. However, singing was a way that enslaved people could communicate, whether it be in worship, during hard labor, or a way to relax in the few times that they were allowed to do so. I think, as we all know, music can connect people and you can communicate through it and you can do feelings. So we can feel that. So it was the same for enslaved people as well. It can overcome barriers such as language, age, or cultural barriers. And within a culture, it can be a very powerful force, and it can be seen with the enslaved communities for sure. So African Americans have used music over the centuries to connect with one another and with heritage from which they were torn. For enslaved individuals, music and dance held both secular and spiritual meaning, and talented Black musicians and singers were praised by whites as well as other Blacks. But at the same time, whites were fearful of Blacks communicating through music. And so they started to restrict music as well. One thing they did is a lot of African music has drumming in it. And they were worried that the drumming would be a way to communicate between communities, enslaved communities, that they should have a revolt or rise up. So some towns actually made it illegal for Black people to use drums in their music. But despite all of those obstacles, enslaved communities were able to develop a strong musical tradition that would still impact American music to this day. Through singing, call and response, and hollering, enslaved people coordinated their labor, communicated with one another across adjacent fields, bolstered weary spirits, and commented on the oppressiveness of their masters. So building community, communicating, bolstering their spirits, all very important things that music were doing for the enslaved people. So that's kind of the background a little bit. Now, Milton House also has a tie to the Underground Railroad. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, Ashley's going to help me out here. Oh, wrong direction. Try clicking again. Okay. There we go. Okay, here it comes. Yes, it's great. I know, we're all learning. I think after 2 years of pandemic, we'd be better at this. But. So most of the true history of the Underground Railroad has been lost due to the secretive nature of the Underground Railroad. People weren't writing things down, but also after the Civil War, historians just weren't interested in the Underground Railroad. So a lot of the information about the Underground Railroad, actually, we lost it when people died, and that went with them. But one topic about it that has been written extensively is about how people were able to communicate on the Underground Railroad. And it's believed that music played an important role in that. So most enslaved people couldn't read, they couldn't write, so you couldn't just hand them directions. A lot of them probably wouldn't be able to read a map, so you couldn't just say, okay, go follow this road and go here. So you had to use things like landmarks or the North Star in order to help them find their way so that they didn't get lost. And music was a way that they could communicate that with people. So that kind of comes back to that Negro spiritual, which were essential to the lives of enslaved people and played a key role in their religious gatherings. So Negro spiritual, if you were just listening to it from the outside, you'd think they were talking about heaven or freedom, when in reality, what they were also talking about was freedom, was getting north, and riding a chariot might be a way that you're escaping from slavery. So again, they could communicate without really drawing any attention to themselves from, their slaveholders, who might be looking for ways that they're trying to communicate with each other. So Negro spirituals like Wade in the Water, The Gospel Train, and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot directly refer to the Underground Railroad. Examples of hidden meanings within these songs are the need for a freedom seeker to walk at night, using handlights and moonlight. When needed, they walked or waded in water so that the dogs could not smell their tracks. They jumped into a chariot where they could hide and ride away. These chariots stopped at some stations, but this word can mean any place where slaves had to go for being in charge. Many slaves in town and in plantations tried to run to a free country that they called my home, or sweet Canaan, the promised land. This country was on the northern side of the Ohio River that they called Jordan. If whites heard any of these songs, it would have been easy for them to assume that the enslaved people were simply singing about finding their way to heaven, not freedom in the north. So I have two examples of some clips, and one of them is the follow the drinking gourd, which is something that we talk about at the Milton House because that was an important one. It was a common way that people refer to the Big Dipper, which points to the North Star. The North Star was important to freedom seekers because by following it, they could ensure that they would be heading north towards freedom. So we'll do, I think it's the one on the right, and this one's a long one, so we'll just do a short, like 30-second snippet of it.
When the sun comes back, when foot's will fall, follow for the old man carries on. But a rebel is mighty good. Jail treat the soul. So as you heard some of the stuff he was talking about the riverbank and how the dead tree will show you the way. So those would have been hidden meanings that people would have been looking to go on the riverbank and looking for a dead tree to go to the next point. So the drinking gourd was definitely one where they were giving directions to people. The next one is, I think, is Wade in the Water. And that's one that's, we can't prove it as historians, but we believe that Harriet Tubman used that story and that song to communicate with people that she was helping to slavery. Again, Wade in the Water was a way to tell people to get off the trail and into the water so that dogs couldn't follow their tracks. Certain songs were believed to contain explicit instructions to fugitive slaves, like the one we just heard, or this one might be like a little bit more of a broad example. We'll just listen to a little bit of Ella Jenkins singing this one. So again, those are just a couple examples of some popular Negro spirituals that are still recorded by artists today, actually. I don't really know where to point the clicker.
You're doing a good job.
So just quick, just wanted to talk about some instruments that were common for enslaved people to use. And what's interesting about these is they're versions of instruments that are popular in Africa, and they were brought over by enslaved communities, and they actually have become almost synonymous with American music, especially like the banjo, drums, the fiddle. Those are all things that, like bluegrass and jazz and the blues are like known for those instruments, and that music's considered very American, when actually it comes very much from the enslaved community. So these are just some examples of some different ones. The one, the kind of gourd, the fiddle one is an interesting one because that's actually made out of a gourd. And then it's got a deer hide that kind of is wrapped around it. And then the bow was made. So it was all hand constructed in South Carolina. It was found as they were doing excavating on a plantation. So that's a very interesting one. The one on the wall, that's a picture I took last year when I was at Belmead plantation, where they talk about the enslaved community and what they were doing, and then examples of a drum and a different style of the banjo. So when they couldn't use music or instruments for whatever reason, whether they didn't have them or it was illegal to do so, kind of like in the first clip we saw where they were just using their hands to kind of make their rhythm. That was something else that makes American music somewhat unique because of our impact from the enslaved community that they have put into American music. So kind of influence on modern music, blues, gospel, jazz, those all come out of, enslaved communities and what they were bringing over from Africa with them. So Black communities played a type of music from which ragtime later descended. Southern plantations, the roots of gospel and blues were introduced in work songs and field hollers based on the musical forms and rhythms of Africa. Meanwhile, another form of the shout, influential in the development of jazz, was practiced within the context of praise and prayer. So in 1840, the first successful wave of acceptance of Black music took over by white performers who performed in blackface. And I always like to remind people, this is the 1840s, so slavery is still very much happening, but now whites are taking what they're hearing from their enslaved communities and they're putting it on the stage and kind of making it their own. And it sets us apart from Europe, which is like opera and that kind of stuff. It's American music, but again, they're stealing it from the Black community. So I always kind of think of blackface or minstrels as being post Civil War, but it was already happening as early as the 1840s in America. Sorry, my voice is like going out all of a sudden. So in 1890s, ragtime music seemed to replace minstrels, with jazz and blues being inspired and born around this time. Ragtime got its name due to the clog dancing known as ragging, which was mostly shuffling. And a musical form of piano blues emerged from ragtime during the 1900s in New Orleans, and it became known as boogie woogie. So blues truly represent the transition from African slave to African American citizenry. And the blues was a soundtrack of those who, in the midst of newfound freedom, struggled to define themselves within the aftermath of slavery, the Industrial Revolution, and the birth of a new form of slavery known as Jim Crow. One element that differentiates the blues from its predecessors is that it's inherently more complex. I'm not going to go any deeper into that because when I was researching this, I had no clue what they were talking about because I'm not a music person, but how they bend notes and what instruments they're using and slides and trills and words I don't understand. It makes it very unique to blues. And again, that's something that came out of America and is now played around the world, but it's something that was developed here. African thread throughout American music can be most notably traced through rhythm. And as blues migrated throughout the country and began affecting the way Americans rethought song form, singing styles, and storytelling, the rhythms began to shift and permeate American music in other ways, slowly giving way to new styles such as rhythm and blues, jazz, rock and roll, funk, and gospel. So again, as slavery ended and then formerly enslaved people were able to move throughout the country, then they start spreading this throughout the country, and you start seeing the influence not just in the South but throughout the entire country. So The influence of Blacks in American history is extensive and is way more than I have time to cover today. However, especially with music, if you want to learn more about the impact of Blacks on American music, I would highly recommend listening to the podcast 1619, specifically episode 3, The Birth of American Music. That's a New York Times podcast that talks about the birth of slavery and the impact it's had on America as a society. But that episode 3 is really interesting, how he goes really in depth to what was happening in American music based on Black influence. So I'd highly recommend that. And then in just a few minutes, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley and Jamie to learn more about Black authors and illustrators. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about why storytelling has always been so important to the Black community. All right, so folklore has always been very important, and it's a tradition that evolved among enslaved African Americans in the 18th and 19th century. So from the earliest colonial settlements, folk tales and fables circulated within slave communities in the South, reflecting the oral traditions of African societies and incorporating African symbolism and motifs. So again, it was a way for them to hang on to that heritage from the countries that they were being torn from, and share it with the next generation. So the details and characters of stories evolved over time in America and kind of transitioned from things you would see in Africa to what you see in America. Though many of the motifs endured, the African hare, for example, continued to play the trickster, but became Briar Rabbit. The African jackal became the American fox, and the African tortoise became a turtle. Even with modifications, however, these tales carried from Africa retained a distinct flavor. Most slaveholders forcibly suppressed the languages, customs, and cultures of the individuals they enslaved. And so Blacks often turned to singing and storytelling as a means of expression, as they had traditionally done in Africa. Their nightly entertainment included tales of the world's creation, heroic deeds, and magic. Those stories took the forms of parables, which conveyed ideas, morals, and cultural values to the listener. One type of African folktale is the how and why story. It's filled with hidden messages and offers moral guidance. Tap in the Land Turtle, for instance, includes references to the brutality of slavery and explains how hope and humor make the circumstances more bearable. The oral tradition kept African folktales alive. Storytelling of that type shares several features with oral traditions around the world. For African Americans, the telling of folktales not only enabled the preservation and dissemination of African culture, but it gave some respite from the unbearable hardships of slavery, if only briefly. The storytelling tradition also encouraged a sense of community and being one of few activities that were not controlled by their white owners. Enslaved people sometimes used folktales to pass coded information about meeting places or escape plans to one another. This theme of outsmarting the slaveholders reflected in many folktales, such as the riddle Tale of Freedom. Although folktale reflected the uncertainties of life for enslaved African Americans, they also provided a message of stability and assurance. The mother image found in some tales, for example, represents tenderness and goodness, while the child hero is a symbol of purity and innocence. The smaller, less powerful creatures, such as Briar Rabbit, always outsmart the larger, stronger characters, such as Briar Fox and Briar Bear. Students of the folktale generally hold that outcomes as representative of the slave's desire to outwit their stronger, more powerful owners. In the brutal world of the enslaved, these images meant a great deal. Slave folktales continue to be an important part of not only African American literature, but also American literature in general. They were first written down in the late 19th century, but became widely available when journalist Joel Handel Harris published Uncle Remus, His Songs and His Sayings, The Folklore of the Old Plantation in the 1880s. Harris's popular book both preserved a significant collection of oral histories, though like so many narratives of that era, its use of a dialect is painful to the modern reader, and introduced many Euro-Americans to the stories of an unknown culture, which was the enslaved culture. So just a little bit of background before I turn it over to you guys.
Well, thank you, Keaton. That was the first time Jamie and I had heard this information too. So that was very,
Really
very
interesting.
Very interesting. So we're kind of going to move forward to kind of storytelling, modern day storytelling. There are many, many great articles and resources talking about the importance of Black storytelling from Black authors, journalists, filmmakers, and more. Storytelling can be done through the written words, the spoken word, and even through pictures and art. I encourage you to read their own words directly about the importance of accuracy and representation. And I will be including some links in the description below this video, so you can kind of explore that on your own. But I wanted to share this quote that kind of ties the past and the present that Keaton talked about into what Jamie and I are going to be talking about. In her article for the Greater Good magazine, multimedia journalist and award-winning author Andrea Collier said, in talking about the Black experience, says that storytelling is our roots and our wings. And continues to say that no matter who you are or where you are from, the human spirit needs to be validated. So I do want to talk about a movement called We Need Diverse Books. It is a grassroots organization of children's book lovers and advocates advocating for essential changes in the publishing industry to produce and promote literature that reflects and honors the lives of all young people. Their vision is to have a world in which children can see themselves in the pages of books. They recognize all diverse experiences, including LGBTQIA, Native, people of color, gender diversity, people with disabilities, and ethnic, cultural, and religious minorities. I think I can speak for both Jamie and I, but in the 10 years of me doing collection development, I have seen an increase in the availability of diverse books. I feel like it's much more easier to find books by Black authors, about Black characters. I'm sure you're seeing that.
Yeah, especially I just feel like in the last couple of years, even
yes.
like
even in the last 2 years, I think it has definitely expanded. And we can kind of, I want to share this video really quick. So that video just kind of shows that young readers are looking for themselves in the pages of the books that they're reading, and that's why We Need Diverse Books is kind of a growing movement. So I did want to share some statistics from the Cooperative Children's Book Center at UW-Madison, and they review books on a yearly basis. And you can see throughout the years that there are more and more books by Black authors and about Black characters. So from even 2011, there was 79 books by Black authors, and by 2021, there's 311. So you can definitely see that more and more books are being made available. So as part of this presentation, Jamie reached out to a number of Black illustrators. She is a children's librarian, so she reads those picture books during story time. So she reached out to 7 Black illustrators, and we asked them several questions, and these are their answers.
Yeah, so for each of the illustrators, I started out with a quote just that I picked from our interview questions that I thought was important. So the first one is Oge Mora, and she says, "I hope my books might help you discover something new or make you smile and laugh. Just like a chef wants someone to enjoy their cooking, I hope my books delight any who read them." So some of the books that she's put out are Thank You, Omu, Saturday, The Oldest Student, and Everybody in the Red Brick Building. And Oge said that she would definitely consider herself a collage artist and painter as far as her style goes. And although things are always changing over time, she believes her work will always reflect her deep appreciation for color, texture, and shape, which you can definitely see just by looking at the cover of her books. Oge started drawing and writing stories as a kid and got her big break in college. She says she gets her inspiration from people and everyday moments. Next up is Laura Freeman. And the quote that I liked that she conveyed was, "I love the fact that I get to learn about great and courageous people from history while working on these books. Their stories inspire me, and I hope that my images contribute to kids reading these books to be inspired also." She's written a ton of biographies. Some of the most notable are Hidden Figures, Kamala Harris, Rooted in Justice, Standing on Her Shoulders, Ida B. Wells' Voice of Truth, and many, many others. You should definitely check her out. Her artwork is amazing. Her illustration style leans toward realism, but she says she does simplify things and also loves to add patterns and symbols to her images. You can kind of see that on the Hidden Figures cover, how their tops have the different equations written in it. So there's always different things to see in her artwork. And I thought this was kind of cool. At 5 years old, she learned from her mother that illustrating children's books was an actual job. And she decided that minute that that's what she would do. And although she got sidetracked with a few other jobs, advertising mostly, she eventually got back into illustrating after an advertisement she did featured a child. She mentioned that she's very fortunate to have had the opportunity to illustrate so many biographies for children and that the stories really inspire her, like she said in her quote. All right, Gordon C. James. He says, I'm inspired by the talented generations of my family that may not have had the same opportunities that I've had to pursue my passion. Some of the most notable books that he's done recently are Crown, an ode to a fresh cut. We have that one at our library. I Am Every Good Thing. And then he's also done a variety of children's biographies as well. He is a self-described oil painter in the tradition of Henry Ossawa Tanner and John Singer Sargent. He does fine art and illustration. So if you check out his website, you should check out all these illustrators' websites because they do a really nice job. You'll find both his illustration work and fine art that you can view. He got into children's picture book illustration with a recommendation from a friend. So his friend wasn't able to do the project, and that's how Gordon got started. He loves giving kids a reflection of themselves in his work and is inspired by the talented generations of his family that didn't have the same opportunities. So that kind of goes back to what Keaton said, like we had so many talented people doing all these amazing things, but they just didn't have the opportunities, and hopefully their opportunities just continue to grow and grow. All right, next we have Katura Arielle. She has done a lot of books recently that you'll see everywhere. I've seen them in Target. I've seen them, I think, in Kohl's. So it's pretty cool. She says her illustration style is fun, yet honest and empowering, colorful and playful. I absolutely love to put extra details into my character's hair, and the hair in these books is amazing. Some of the books that she has done, I Believe I Can, I Am Enough, The Night Is Yours, and A is for All Things You Are. Katura has a fun, colorful style. She loves to put extra details into her character's hair, like she mentioned. And she started with drawing and painting, but now uses a lot of digital elements in her work. After she received her Bachelor's of Fine Arts, she decided to take a risk and put her work online. And you'll hear that a number of times with some of the other upcoming artists that I'm going to mention, that they finally decided, like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to put this out there. And then the opportunities just began flowing. She sells her work on mugs and shirts and totes. She has an online store, which is really cool. You should check it out. She believes the best part of being a children's illustrator is filling a void for children who grew up not seeing themselves reflected in the world and in media, which goes back to what Ashley was saying about why we need diverse books. And we do have a link to a short PBS biography about Katura. Do you want to, should we show it, or they can check it out later?
How long?
It's like 3 minutes.
Let's check it out later.
But it is really cool. It talks about her store,
Yeah.
and she's just very down to earth, and I think you'll like it.
Yeah,
So
I'll
definitely.
include the link below.
Okay. All right. So moving on. There's the video. Okay. Sheree Miller. She says the best part about illustrating for children is getting to continuously revisit the funnest times of my life when I was a child. Telling stories to the next generation that will inspire their imagination is a great privilege. She has done the books Princess Hair, Don't Touch My Hair, Michelle's Garden, which is about Michelle Obama. And she has a new graphic novel coming out this year called Curl Friends, which sounds awesome. She has a fresh, colorful style, and she says her work has become more detailed over time. If you look at just like the pictures in Princess Hair, it's crazy because they all have like different patterns on their shirts and stuff. It's pretty cool. She studied illustration at Pratt Institute and continued writing and drawing until she was able to publish her first book. So basically she just like didn't give up. She said, I'm doing this. She finds inspiration in lots of places, including just like when she's out walking or hanging out with friends. But what she really loves is being able to revisit the best times from her childhood and share those fun stories. All right, this is Javaka Steptoe. He was introduced to the craft by his father, and he says, I grew up watching him writing and illustrating and learning how powerful children's books can be to a developing child. You would probably recognize a lot of his father's work too, if you check that out. Some of Javaka's books are Radiant Child, which is a story of the artist John, I'm going to forget it, Basquiat. And then he's also written illustrated What's Special About Me, Mama, and Jimmy Sounds Like a Rainbow, which is a story of Jimi Hendrix. He uses collage and assemblage to create art. I had to look up assemblage, but it's actually just like what it sounds like. It's just gathering things together, choosing materials to help tell the story. So one of the examples that he gave was there was a book about basketball, and he did like laying things out on asphalt so that it would, like the materials help convey the story. Like I said, he was introduced to writing and illustrating by his father, John. And just watching his dad write, he said he was inspired by the work he did and inspired by life and the work of other artists as well. And then the last one I have today is Daria Peoples Riley. She says the very best part of illustrating books for children is when I have the opportunity to meet my readers. And this makes sense. She was a teacher to start with, so I can totally see that. Some of the books that she's written are America, My Love, America, My Heart, I Got Next, which is a basketball story. This Is It, Gloria Takes a Stand. She said that even though her style changes and grows, her artistic voice remains constant and is identifiable in all her books. She started out as a teacher and did painting and drawing just in her free time. But like I mentioned before, she was another one who just got brave enough to share her art in an online portfolio. And after a few years, she said her work became strong enough to be traditionally published. So she loves observing the world and letting her art become a visual representation of what she sees. And she is inspired by life and the people she meets.
So all these books are available through our online catalog. So we definitely encourage everyone to take a look at those and the other Black illustrators that are out there. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to our presentation. If you want to learn more about the Milton House Museum, definitely reach out to Keaton or visit the Milton House Museum. Or come to the library here, and we have tons of resources about the Underground Railroad. We have access to all these books from these illustrators. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.